I last week that's what I meant. Noi alla sessione sì, ma domani
Okay. I have your attention. First, I need to give you some housekeeping information, important housekeeping information. The bus to the tour leaves at 8 o'clock outside this hotel. So, in 12 years, I have left 1 or 2 people off the bus. So I wouldn't say I do it often, but there was a threat there. It was a credible threat. I even saw that person running after the bus, and I taught them a lesson. All right? So it could happen. It will then go, so 8 o'clock there, and then it will pass past the palace there. So you have to be out the front, I guess, also waiting there at 1 minute after 8, or 2 minutes after 8, okay? And then we will go up to the gala dinner, and you do not want to miss the gala dinner, right? The other thing is, if you are planning on coming to the tour and or the dinner tomorrow night, and you have not written your name down, please do, because we need to organize buses, right? So I will remind you after this session, but please do that immediately before you go anywhere else if that's part of your plan. Okay, with that out of the way, let me make a very quick introduction for our second keynote speaker, Sandra Mcnelly. So Sandra, it's wonderful to have Sandra here. Her name has been on many, many papers presented at this conference, but it's the first time we've managed to get her to make the trip. So Sandra has a PhD from UCL. She's currently director of a number of things, actually. She's a professor at the University of Surrey. She's a professor, she's a CEP. She's the director of the let me get it right, Centre for Vocational Educational Research, CVER, also at the LSE. You're the director of the Education and Skills Program at CEP. You publish widely, almost exclusively in economics of education, in a number of leading field and general journals, including the EJ, J-Pub Income, Joel, etc. I won't go on, there's no need to. She speaks for herself. She's going to give a paper on what makes a good college. So please thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin and Giuseppe. People have been telling me for years, this is a fantastic conference. Why aren't you coming? You should really come to this conference. And now I'm here, and I'm just delighted to be here. And I must say, all the good things people have said have proven to be true. And it is an honor to be asked to be a keynote speaker. So thank you very much for that as well. So what makes a good college? I'm going to start by saying what are colleges, because in different countries, college means different things. And in England, colleges are institutions that deliver 16 to 18 education, so upper secondary education in England, but they also do other things. They do adult education and training. So that's just what they are. So these colleges, these institutions have a really crucial role for equipping people with intermediary skills that are useful if they go into the labour market directly, that are very important if you progress into education as well. So that's one reason to care about them. It's important not just for the labour market returns to individuals themselves, but important for all of us, because even if we graduate with university degrees or at the higher ability end or the higher skill end, we still work with people who have intermediary skills who've gone to these colleges. So it's important for the whole economy that the skills provided in these institutions are good, and that these institutions are good. And also important for social mobility. I say that because a lot of people from disadvantaged backgrounds go to these institutions. In fact, they take basically everybody who doesn't do well at school, and they take lots of other people too. I'm not saying they only take people who are disadvantaged or who are low achieving, but they do take all of them as well as other people. So that's there could be potentially important institutions for social mobility, in that the people you want to help rise up are the people indeed who go to those institutions. And the context of my talk is experience in England. So it is specific to that context, of course, but I do hope that some of the lessons that we've learned from the data that we have and the things we've been able to look at are of more general interest. So my talk will draw on 3 papers, 2 of which I'm a co-author, and 1 of which I would like to be a co-author, but I don't. One is on the value added of institutions, and then and that sort of sets up other things that I've been involved in nicely, which is why I've chosen that paper to kind of lead into the other 2 papers about capital expenditure and management practices, which are 2 different ways of really investing in the infrastructure of these institutions. So I've said that. They further in sixth form colleges, they enroll about half of a school leaving cohort after lower secondary education, which ends at age 16 with the GCSEs, national exam that basically everybody takes. The sixth form colleges, sixth form colleges are small institutions, and then you can do your academic education there. They don't do vocational education very much. The bigger institutions are further education colleges, and they have lots of vocational options, and you can combine vocational and academic education. And I'm going to focus my talk on young learners, because this is where we focus, not necessarily because that's the more interesting thing, it's just that our data enable us to say more about young learners, and studying adult learners is harder. So that's why we haven't done more, but I think it's a very important area. Explain a little bit more about the UK education context to people who are not familiar, or specifically England really. So we have full-time compulsory education of a quite general nature between age 5 and age 16, primary and then secondary school. You finish with your GCSEs, then you do upper secondary education. You can either stay in the same school and do academic education, or to a sixth form college if your school doesn't go up to 18. Or you can go to a further education college, and you do about 2 years there. Maybe some people might only do 1 year there, but 2 years there. Officially, you're supposed to be in some form of education until age 18. So most people will be there. There won't be that much dropout before age 17 anyway, and a little bit of dropout at that point. But you're not really supposed to drop out completely until age 18. And then there's higher education. Higher education in England is mostly degrees, and it's mostly at universities. There are some higher vocational courses you can do, that are diplomas and certificates that are shorter, and that would be vocational, but there's very, very few of those in England, especially relative to lots of other countries. So it's kind of unusual, and the government would quite like to change that. So I've already said something about this in my introduction, about the importance of training people in intermediary skills, and without good provision, individuals might either drop out too soon or they might underachieve. And it can be very hard to recover in England. The funds available for adult education are not very high, and they've really declined over time. And as I indicated, those from further education colleges are more likely to come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So if you look at whether they were eligible to receive free school meals when at school or some sort of income support. The families were in some sort of income support. About 15% of them were eligible to receive free school meals at school, and that compares to about 7% of those who remain in the same school for their upper secondary education. Again, sort of just a contextual slide to show you, some of the, educational attainment in the working age population in different countries and where England is within that. So we do have a lot of people who have tertiary education, higher education, that means in England basically degrees. But we have an awful lot of people who don't make it. So there's an awful lot of people at the lower end of the spectrum too. That doesn't mean they left school at age 16, by the way, below upper secondary education. They may have spent time in a college, just not done achieved very much. They might never have got above the level equivalent to GCSEs. And then there's a big part in the middle too, so people with just upper secondary education. So there's an awful lot of scope for a progression within England, as in other countries. Ideally, you'd like to see people progress from below upper secondary to upper secondary education, and more people from upper secondary education to tertiary education as well. And although England's about average in the OECD, there's other countries that do better. Further education is known as the Cinderella sector in England in the media. Because it's overlooked quite often, because of specialism in vocational education. In other countries, doing vocational education is prestigious. I mean, it's not as prestigious as going to a university, an academic university, but it is considered a very good option. In England, it is less so. And it is sometimes sadly overlooked in policy discussion, as I realized through working in this area, that if you publish a paper on vocational education, it's much harder to get coverage in the newspapers than if you're doing something, even if it's quite a small thing, in schools, for example. It has been subject to a funding squeeze over recent years, especially within the adult budget, which is cut by about half over the last 10 or 15 years. But also 16 to 18 funding is less generous than pre-16 funding, and there isn't any pupil premium. So in other words, there isn't any compensatory payments given for the fact that you have more disadvantaged students when you get to further education, unlike pre-16 where there is. And finally, there is not as much work by academics done in this area relative to work on schools and universities, I would say in general, and the exception being if you go to somewhere like Switzerland, where I've just been, or Germany, where lots of people do good work on this. So there's plenty of good work. It's just, I would say, not as much in this area as in schools and universities. These are the three papers that I'm going to draw on in my talk. So starting with the Estimating Value Added in Further Education Colleges by my colleagues, Esteban Chicho, Claudia Hopkow, and Jennifer Valenzuela. Then I'm going to talk about the role of capital expenditure and the role of management practices. We're looking at very similar outcomes, similar institutions, similar data in all of the papers, so I think they complement each other very well. They are all recently published in the discussion paper series of CBR, and hopefully one day will find their way into journals, the first one being closer to that than the other two so far. So the data that we have at the moment, we have the longitudinal educational outcomes, or LEO data, which you may have heard in some of the other talks today. So that's the National Pupil Database. It's a census of all pupils in state schools, which is about 92% of students in England. And then you have information on the demographics, basic demographics, schools attended, and their tests and exams, where there's a good national test at age 11 and age 16. You've got the individual learner record, which follows them into further education and gives them information about their courses attended and their qualifications. Similar data sets on higher education. And then finally, we have tax records on earnings and employment, and this is all linked together for pupils who were in state schools in 2002 onwards. So the oldest cohort is just in their early 30s now. So still not old enough really to get a good lifetime sense of returns, but you'll be hearing about this data more and more, especially as people age and Fortunately, access to this data has suddenly become a lot better, so I'm sure there'll be a lot more people working on it as well. The outcomes emphasized in our work is in enrolling or achieving what's called a level 3 qualification. That means a good upper secondary qualification, although you don't necessarily have to have achieved it when you're that age. You can come back and achieve it later. There is a labour market return to level 3. It's at least 6% on average, but there's an awful lot of heterogeneity around that. It depends a lot on the subject you study, a bit like higher education in that way. But it is crucial for getting into higher education. You do need a level 3 qualification, and it is, it is quite important, even if you just go directly into the labour market for that as well. So we think that's an important type of outcome that is, that we would like to see reduced by these institutions, and that's the reason why we focus on that a lot. Then there's attending higher education, which has a high return in lots of countries. It has a high return in England. Again, heterogeneous depending on exactly the subject you do, but on average there is a high return to higher education, has been for some time. And then finally, earnings and employment, but we're a little bit, don't use that so much in the studies that I will tell you about, because our cohorts that we're looking at are just very young, so it's not as useful for us. And especially if people are going to higher education, then by definition, they're not really properly in the labour market yet, so it's hard to look at both. Apart from the first study, they are able to use that information effectively. I'll go on to show you how. This is just some descriptive statistics from the first paper that I referred to. And I just wanted to show you this, and there's about 260 or so colleges. And I just wanted to show you that there's the kinds of things people do within these colleges. So maximum level enrolled is level 2 or below, that sort of GCSE level or below, low level vocational qualifications. And maximum level is about 30% for the younger people. And for older people, and then there's quite a bit of progression to higher education. So about 30 to 35% sort of younger people will go into higher education at some point. They will not usually do their higher education at the FE college. Usually that's in university. Sometimes you can do higher education in further education colleges, but that's not typical. And also another thing is that many people, even younger people, have had some employment experience at some point in the data before they enter FE or when they're in FE. Part-time working is quite common, so you do have some information on that too. So from the first paper, estimating value added in further education colleges, there are 2 approaches that the authors use. One of them is a sort of cross-sectional approach. You've got a lot of young learners, you've got a large set of controls, you have their prior achievement, their demographics, the quality of the secondary school attended, the quality of the neighbourhood, and they can control for all that, and they can estimate a value-added model of FE colleges, and the assumption, making a selection on observables assumption. So if you want to get into how credible that is in that context, which I assure you it is, you need to read their paper. So I encourage you to do so. I'm not going to go into the detail here. Then the other approach, they have that approach, and then they have the lag-dependent variable when they have wages or employment as an outcome. And then they have some models, this works for older people, well, it works for some younger people as well, where they can have an individual fixed effects model, and they can basically look at the return before and after, the earnings or employment before and after they enter the college, and compute the value-added estimates that way. So this is the sort of estimation approach they use, just to show you the estimation equation. That's just the cross-sectional approach I mentioned, and that's the lag-dependent variable there that you see as one of the regressors. So they estimate that regression first, and you do that without controlling for college fixed effects. You use the approach implemented in the value-added model literature, and you, as I said, first stage, you estimate the OLS without including fixed effect college dummies, and then you have a second step where you estimate the population standard deviation of the further education college value added, and you do some shrinkage estimates as well. These are the results that you get for younger learners, and the dependent variable here is daily earnings. So they show you here, this is CS is cross-sectional, that's just the raw value added, and this is the effect they show from controlling for various different things. You get to the very the last two estimates, which show you what happens when you do the cross-sectional approach and you control for everything, and you do the panel. Then there's the panel estimate where you do the before and after estimate. And then, so you see that, whichever approach, it gives you something quite similar once you put in all the controls, but the estimate is quite small. So basically, a 1 standard deviation increase in college value added increases your earnings by about 3%. So it's not really that big, and there isn't that much variation. So unlike, say, universities, where probably there's a bit more variation about how much value added going to different institutions gives you, that's not really the case in further education colleges. And indeed, most people go to their local college. You don't really move to go to your college here. When you look at educational outcomes, and this is particularly why I'm focusing on the paper to help me with my other papers I want to talk about, you do see there's a bit more action. And I would particularly highlight ever in higher education. Remember, the baseline there was only about 30%. Going to a college that's 1 standard deviation higher in quality will increase the probability of ever going to higher education by about 4 percentage points, roughly, which is quite high on average. And there's also quite a bit of variation going on there. And also the achievement at level 3 is about 4.5 percentage points. And those are the two results that I want to emphasize and have on your mind when I'm showing you the results from the other two papers. The first, so what I'm looking at here is how might value added be improved? That's the sort of broader context. So what ways could you invest in the infrastructure to improve value added? You could have capital investment, and you could have management practices, and once you invest in those things, the return lasts for a few periods. So it's not like a current expenditure, the same thing every year. Obviously, there's a much broader agenda on what makes a good college, the one I'm going to cover here. There's the quality of the teaching workforce, the curriculum, pedagogy, mentoring, financial aid, role of employers, and covered extremely well, I think, in the literature about community colleges in the United States. Some contributors here in this room. But I do think when we haven't looked at all of that in the English system, although that would be extremely important to one day be able to do that. But I would say there are probably complementarities between these things, that if you have good management practices, for example, you might be able to scale up some of the things that Susanna was talking about earlier today. So why might capital grants have an effect on student outcomes? Substantial expenditure on new equipment, laboratories, workshops may improve learning in courses that rely on specific and costly equipment. And it may also be that better buildings lead to greater student and teacher morale. We all like to work in a nice place. But of course, as we all know who've ever experienced building works going on in our premises, that it can be extremely disruptive to productivity in the short term. So you might have to wait a while before you see those positive outcomes emerge. So we looked at this, capital grants account for about 10% of the further education budget, but annual expenditure has declined in recent years. The government commissioned a review of post-18 education, which reported in 2019, and as a consequence, they committed to increasing large-scale capital expenditure, at least in the 2020 budget. At least that hasn't, to my knowledge, been taken away just yet. So, what is our contribution in this study? Well, because of the data that we have, it's very rare when looking at capital expenditure to have information on administrative data on students and be able to follow them longitudinally. So we are able to do something that hasn't been done, to our knowledge, very often in this literature. And also the existing literature about capital expenditure is on schools, and it's often about building new schools. And it's in the United States. almost the entire literature is in the United States. There is one paper in the US that is similar to us in that they are looking at 2-year community colleges, which are quite similar to further education colleges. So we combine the administrative data that I just discussed with information from the Department of Education on capital expenditure projects where we have some information on them, and the project and the grant value, the date of approval, and the project description. And we have some college accounts data as well that we merge in. And our focus is on large capital grants only. So we don't want to look at just regular maintenance. We want to look at sort of a big splash on something that's going to make a difference to what students see and what their learning experience is like. Something that plausibly might have an impact at some point on learning outcomes, or should have an impact on learning outcomes. So we look at large grants only in the first and second quartile of the grant distribution, and that accounts for most projects, especially when you get to the second quartile, and it accounts for over 80% of the value of the grants as well. I'm going to focus on, in my talk, only on grants in the first quartile because I don't want to be too repetitive or take too long on this particular paper, but the results are very similar whether you look at grants in the first quartile or grants in the first and second quartile. A little bit stronger for the first quartile than if you look at the first and second quartile, but similar. The research is not design, it's a difference. It's a difference is design. Our treatment group is further education colleges that received the large grants between 2006 and 2009. And our control group are those colleges that received a large grant after 2011 and up to 2015. And we can see student level outcomes up to 2017. So that's what we have. That's what we can work with. The identifying assumption is just parallel pre-trends. Our treatment and our control colleges can't be on a differential trend before they get the capital grant, and that's our assumption. And I will show you event studies that hopefully convince you on the plausibility of the assumption in our context. Of course, differences and differences, new paper every week on this, and what do you do with all of this? Well, we think our approach does, means that we're okay in terms of what the literature has said about all the issues with differences and differences. The reasons being, we go into this a bit more in the paper, we only use future treated colleges as the controls for the treated colleges only. We stack each cohort of treatment colleges with a cohort of these future treated colleges, and we consider treatment effects in a fixed time window, either side of the grant approval, similar to Martorell and co-authors. And this is an example of one cohort. We have 4 grant cohorts. So we have our pre-treatment period for this grant cohort of 3 years. We have the date of the grant approval, and we go up to 5 years post-treatment. As it turns out in the data, we see a construction period of about 2 or 3 years, and then we see 2 years after that. Our control colleges, they get the grant approval for this cohort in 2011. So that's the sort of intuition for how this works. This is our estimating equation. I don't need to talk through it because I've just explained the intuition. I just want to show you we have an estimating equation. Okay. I want to get on to the interesting part now, which is the results. This is the project timing and the college level inputs for grants in the top quartile only. Okay, so you see nothing happening prior to grant approval. We get to 0, which is when the project is approved, and then you can see capital grants going up and up, and then hit down again 3, and by the time they get to 4, they're back to the same as they were before. So that's the sort of capital grants, and then we see sort of a similar thing happening to fixed assets. So it increases and then it stabilizes. It takes about 2 years for the 3 years for that process to work out. What happens in the college? First of all, do we see the students, colleges with big capital grants getting more students? No, we don't. They're the same number of students before and after. But we do see a different profile of students coming in. We see students coming in with better GCSE results. And we also see, I'm not showing on the graphs, but from less likely to come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So you are seeing different composition. And that might be considered, the college may like that. They may like the fact that, they're getting a better, an intake that from higher achieving intake might help the college. This is some of the outcomes that I mentioned that we were particularly interested in here. Enrolled in a level 3 course, ever observed in higher education. Remember, you can't take it for granted that people will enroll in a level 3 course, because ideally you want people to progress from level 2 into level 3, and they don't always do that. Level 3 is an important type of qualification to get. And that's a contemporaneous thing. So you see that nothing happens prior to grant approval, and 3 or 4 years after the grant is approved, you do see people enrolling in level 3 qualifications in greater numbers. And you do see, for people who are in the college 3 years after the grant is approved, that their probability of ever attending higher education at some point, to the extent that we can observe them, we don't observe them for that long, just for a few years, in the early 20s. And you do see that they do have a higher probability of going into higher education. These are the regression estimates that are similar, except it doesn't have the pre-approval years, the pre-trends here. Our baseline is just T-1. And there you can see that what I've put in red is when you see the effects kick in, and you see that, the first column is when you don't control for the prior achievement of students, and the second column is when you do. And you can see that some of the effect is just capturing this change in composition. But even net of the change in composition, you still see more people enrolling in level 3 qualifications. Now, conditional and enrolling, you don't see any change in achievement, but that's okay. I mean, you're getting more people to enroll, and then they enroll, but they don't drop out, so the achievement rate stays the same as it was before. And then you see people also progressing to higher education, and they progress to higher education about 3 percentage points, roughly, after you take account of controls. So the results suggest that receiving a capital grant increases enrollment in level 3 qualifications by 4 to 5 percentage points, and that's, if we compare it to the first paper I mentioned on value added, remember that 1 standard deviation increase in college quality increased the likelihood of obtaining a level 3 qualification by 4.4 percentage points. So in a very similar ballpark to that. And then similarly, results suggest that receiving a capital grant increases the probability of attending higher education by about 3 percentage points. And that effect is large, considering that only 28% of the students in our sample progress to higher education within the sample period. And it's pretty similar to the value-added paper. It's just a little bit short of the effect of increasing college quality by 1 standard deviation. Amelia.
Is it okay to interrupt?
Yes.
I just wanted to understand a little bit better. I mean, I seem to find that these effects can mainly explained by a change in the composition of the students they enroll. So they basically, because they open the new wing of the school or have a big gym or something, they are able to enroll students with better GCSEs, right? So the numbers don't change, but the composition changes, and then that kind of filters through in terms of better achievement at level 3 and higher education. So
that's part of the story, but even conditional on GCSE measures, you see this. So this is conditional on GCSE. So yes, you see, if we didn't conditional on GCSE, you'd see a bigger measure, and that would conflate the composition with the effect. Okay.
So there is actually, so this is a true effect on,
Well, yes, we would argue that's a true effect on achievement. Yes, net of the composition. Yes. And of course, we can't say very much about the mechanism in this paper. This is just looking at the kind of reduced form causal impact of increasing capital grants. So we don't know exactly what the colleges did, what the mechanism was, but that's just what we can't do that in this paper. But we can at least say what is the causal impact the government's increase in capital expenditure by all this amount, you can't take it for granted. It will have an impact on student outcomes. And I think what the benefit of what we've done is we can show you do see a tangible impact on student outcomes within a reasonable time frame. And of course, there may be other benefits to capital expenditure too. It's not necessarily all about increasing achievement. There may be other reasons why you want to improve the capital expenditure in colleges. You want to retain your teaching staff. You want to make it a pleasant place to work and a pleasant place to work for teachers and students. So, and the compositional thing might matter for that as well. So I'm not saying that if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, you only want to consider the outcomes we've chosen to look at. But at least, if you're interested, you want to see that it has at least some impact on student outcomes, and we do see that is indeed the case.
So that could be sort of peer-to-peer effect.
It could be through many things. It could be through some peer effect as part of it, yes.
Do you know what happens to the displaced students? If student numbers are the same, the achievement students are going in,
They're not displaced because the numbers don't change. The numbers of people, not the numbers, the composition changes, but the higher achieving people come in, but the number of students doesn't change.
So if there's more high achieving students coming in than the ones that stay the same, does that mean low achievers have to leave?
Well, not leaving. I mean, they're not leaving it. So, I mean, the numbers are staying the same. So it sounds that they're attracting some of the higher ability. They're attracting some people within the number who are higher ability students. I don't necessarily think that means that you need to have displacement. But I need to think about that. I'll move on. Okay, I'll take one more question, then I'll move on, because otherwise I'm afraid I won't get to the near the end. Yes, one more.
Okay, this is a pretty short one. How often do colleges receive grants?
Well, I mean, the first quartile was 37 colleges, so not that often. You wouldn't often get a very, very big capital grant like that. Like the capital grants are about 30 million. So on average, so it's high, so it's not every college gets one, and they're not just doled out like every very quickly. Yes, so we don't have that problem of colleges getting big capital grants at multiple time periods in our time frame. Okay. I'll continue, and then if there are more questions, we can stop again. Okay. And basically for the labour market outcomes, we don't see that much going on. There is some effect on employment and probabilities at T+4. There's nothing going on for earnings, but the earnings are hard to interpret. If you have more people going into progressing and going on to higher education, staying on in education longer, they're not going to be entering into, you're going to have negative selection into the labour market. These are quite young people, so we don't think the earnings information is really that informative for people this age. But there is some effect on the employment probability. It's a little bit noisy, though, if we go between the two samples that I referred to. And the second kind of piece of work that's also looking at investment in infrastructure is about management practices. So just check the time. How much time?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay, perfect. So I'll take...
With some questions.
Okay. So the World Management Survey, people haven't heard of it before, was originally developed for the manufacturing sector and consists of 18 questions related to operations, management, targets, and incentives. They have a website that goes into it in great detail, and you can find loads of studies on it. And the methodology has been applied in a variety of sectors, including schools and universities. So here, our starting point is a school survey, and then we adapted that to further education. These are the sorts of questions that are asked. There are operations, so that's about matching learners to courses, standardization of teaching processes, data-driven planning and learning transitions, that sort of thing is in operations. Monitoring, performance tracking, performance review, consequence management, target setting, target balance, target interconnection, target stretch, and so on. People talent management, rewarding high performers, promoting high performers, managing talent, retaining talent, fixing poor performers. these are the different spheres that the World Management Survey covers. We're focusing on practices on 16 to 19 provision. That's what we said, 2 principles, because we're recognizing that colleges do many, many things, and we wanted to focus on young people in particular. We tried to get all colleges, as many colleges involved as possible. We got a response rate of 25%, which is very good in this literature. You're asking for about an hour of the principal's time, and they are running big institutions. So they're very busy people, and they could be the principal or the deputy principal. A nice feature of this methodology is that, first of all, you get very trained people to do the interviews, and the people we had doing the interviews had applied to the World Management Survey before in a different context, so they really knew how to do it. The interviewer doesn't have any metrics on the institution when they're doing the interviewing, and the person on the other end of the phone doesn't realize that they are being scored. The interviewer is being listened into by the manager, and the manager scores as well in 80% of the cases so that they can compare. And so there's lots of very, very high standard of interviews going on here. We have lots of colleges participating in our survey, and there were 79 that did, and they're all around the country. So the yellow triangles are the colleges that we managed to interview, so all over the place. And they do tend to be larger than average, the ones that we got in our survey. But once you look at things at a per pupil level, they're pretty similar to colleges nationally. They don't seem to have better learning outcomes. So it wasn't just the higher performing colleges that we got or anything like that. This is the histograms of how the colleges actually did on the various kinds of scores that I looked at. So there's average management scores and operations, monitoring, targeting, people management. They did extremely well. Most colleges scored between 4 and 5, so that's very high. Much better than schools and universities. For reasons we didn't find that we don't think our sample is more selected than the other work in this literature, so that was interesting as well. In terms of how they did in the different types of management score, they're quite correlated, all of these things. People management is the worst, and that's sort of what you expect and what's being observed before in this sort of sector, is because when you're working in education, there's very limited things you can do to actually retain talent. You've got no money. So how are you going to, pay people to stay on and things like that? So there's limits on what you can do to retain talent, and that is the worst one. But there's still reasonably good scores on the 4 dimensions. These are just scatter plots. So they're just looking at how the management score correlates with the outcome of interest. So this is at institutional level, and I'm only going to show you a few of these. I'm going to bore you to death if I have to try and show you all of the things that we can look at. So this is the share of students satisfied and the proportion of learners achieving level 3 aims, so just contemporaneous outcomes, and they are positively correlated. And when you look at the individual level, now for individual level data, we did have to do something special because we want to look at individuals with enough time to see how they progressed, but at the same time as the current principal was still in the college. So we have to reduce our sample to principals who were there 6 years ago, and then just look at the sensitivity. If we said, principal there 5 years ago or 7 years ago, would we have got similar results? So we reduced our sample in that way so that we could look at longer term outcomes. And this is the scores. This is just a scatter plot, so you can see a positive correlation with whether someone achieved level 3 by age 20 and whether they're pursuing a degree by age 20. This is just the estimation equation. This is very simple methodology. We do have good data, so we have very good controls, and particularly prior achievement at age 16. GCSE scores is a particularly good one, but we have some demographics as well. We have some information on the geography of areas that we include. We constructed some things like looking at school competition measures or further education competition measures as well. Some for local GDP, measures of local economic population density and local GDP to capture sort of growth as well. The only difference between the institutional level regressions and the individual level regressions is at the individual level we can do much more than we can at the institutional level, and of course it's a smaller sample as well. These are the results. I won't go through all of them with at the institutional level, so we're still looking at the full sample here. And as we go through the different columns, we put more and more controls in. So whatever we look at, share satisfied or learner satisfaction, employer satisfaction, school, that's the school standards agency that come around and they monitor you and they give you a score. Then we look at hard outcomes that we can see in our administrative data. And you see basically in the last column that there is a positive correlation with management practices. So if management practices increase by 1 standard deviation, you would improve the share satisfied by about 3 percentage points. That's what the interpretation is. You can kill these results if you put in enough controls for interviewer dummies, time of day dummies, take out the one outlier, so you can destroy this. But these are our preferred estimates. If you look at the individual level data, you can't kill this. It's you have bigger sample sizes. It is clustered at the institutional level, but you get sort of similar types of results, and you have an awful lot more controls in here as well. So if you have a management score, if you improve management in the college by 1 standard deviation, that is associated with a probability of achieving level 2 or more by nearly 1 percentage points, and level 3 or more by 2 percentage points, and achieving a degree at some point by age 20 by 2 percentage points. And that is from a baseline of 23 percentage points in our sample that we have and are using in this data. So that's reasonably good. This is the most interesting thing. You could argue, oh, well, how can you distinguish between management practices and in the institution? How can you control for the fact that principals might select into colleges with particular characteristics? And, we can't do that in cross-sectional data very well. But what we can do is to say, well, we'll control for the institution and we look to see if management practices interact with characteristics of the students in the college. And there we see a positive, in bold, you see positive interaction between being free school meal student, so being poor student, and the probability of achieving level 3 or more and level 2 or more by age 20. Not a degree level, but then again, there's not very many of those students who will have the right prerequisites to be ever on a degree. So very few of them actually will get onto a degree anyway. So that's very interesting. That result is robust to including other interactions with free school meals. So we just not just management scores, but other things as well. So it's quite a robust result and suggests that management practices is not only associated with positive outcomes on average, but it's complementary. It helps people from disadvantaged backgrounds in particular. So if you do a hypothetical scenario where a learner is moved from a college at the 10th percentile of management practices to the 90th percentile, this would be associated with a 8 percentage point higher probability of achieving level 3, which is about half the raw gap between free school meals and non-free school meals students. So main takeaways: management practices appear to matter as a predictor of achievement even after including detailed controls. At lower level of achievements, management practices appears to matter more for learners from disadvantaged backgrounds, and improved management practices may therefore play an important role for improving social mobility. And what I haven't showed you, because I didn't want to go too much into every set of results, is that progression to higher education is driven by individuals who enter a college with relatively good achievement. So bringing the findings together from the whole lot of papers that I've shown you to see. And my last slide. So variation in institutional value added in terms of earnings is limited, but more important for educational progression in England. Capital grants and management practices are different aspects of college infrastructure and investment lasting over several years, and both are effective for improving these outcomes. Now, you might say, well, which do you prefer, management practices or capital grants? Well, Improving management practices by one standard deviation would improve educational progression by 1/2 to 2/3 of receiving the very large capital grants, just using the findings for both studies together and taking them at face value. And the latter is the same as a ballpark is improving college quality by one standard deviation. So I thought, given that very large capital grants are £30 million roughly, unless it's very expensive to improve management practices, and that would be probably the most cost-effective thing to do, in very narrow terms. But in reality, of course, these things work together. You don't just do one. And if you had allowed a college to become really run down, well, nobody might want to come to it. And, the sorts of people who would be in a good position to implement good management practices mightn't want to be at the college. So you probably can't do one or the other. You probably need to do both. Moving into the future, of course, it would be wonderful to know more about how you can actually improve management practices. So it's all very well to say, well, it's good to have management practices, like it's good to have improved teacher quality, but how do you actually do it? And how can you do the training for management practices? And those sorts of randomized experiments would be a very interesting thing to do in the future. And as I said before, any cost-benefit analysis wouldn't just look at the outcomes that we've looked at anyway. The good thing about both of these things is that the benefits last for over time for multiple cohorts. So you're not just looking at the benefits for one cohort, but over many, many cohorts if they provide that they last and they're maintained. I'll finish there unless there are other questions.
Well, we have time. Thank you, Sandra.
Okay.
Questions?
Yes. Well, we didn't find that. We did look at whether the sample was balanced or compared to, or how different they were from the colleges that we didn't survey, and we basically found it was similar for both the colleges where the principal was there 6 years, for colleges where the principal hadn't been there 6 years ago. So we did look at it, but we didn't find it to be an important issue.
When you say anything about the different domains of the management score, everything you showed was just the composite management score. You actually have management people.
They're pretty similar on all of the things. They were similar. I think the people management might be the more important one, slightly the more important one, but there isn't that much between them. Yeah, and they're all obviously positively correlated with each other. And one thing I didn't show you as well was there was a leadership score, and we did leadership against management scores, and we still found that both are correlated, correlated to the extent when you put them in together, you reduce the coefficients on both, but you still get management practices kind of inching above the leadership. But ideally, of course, kind of want to distinguish it even more than what we've been able to do in the paper, and distinguish the two things. Amelia.
In my first sort of research design, we were looking at the capital grant expenditure on a sort of longitudinal sort of scale. Are you able, I'm still thinking about the compositional effect, that's fine. But also, are you able to also look at the quality, so to speak, of the teachers? So if you were to link that with, I don't know, workforce census or something like that. So as the school improve their, parents or facilities and so on, are they also able to attract better teachers, with more experience perhaps, or better qualifications and so on? Is that something that
we haven't really been able to look at that. We haven't been able to have a data set of teachers that we could merge into this, unfortunately. I'm not sure how helpful that would be, because the colleges are so big and there are so many teachers, and many of them work part-time in FE. So even if we had it, we don't have it, but even if we had it, they're large. I mean, I think the weakness of English data is many, many strengths, but one of the weaknesses is that we can't, in most data sets, link who's doing the teaching and who's being taught. So yeah, it's a more macro level. So it's looking at, the first paper is looking at capital grants, and the second paper is looking at management of the teachers, management of the whole institution, but of course nothing about the teacher workforce.
So you can't link it at all.
I don't think so. We've linked to everything that we could, to everything we could get our hands in, and all the balance sheets of we kind of mined the data for anything we could find. We didn't find that much actually. I haven't talked about what influences management practices, but one of the things that came out of that is whether the principal has a management training, has training in management, is correlated with their own management practices. Positively, yes. But when you put in other controls, everything just disappears. So not much comes out. One of the competition measures comes out strong, but then another competition measure doesn't come out. So can't say much. So nothing that we have really can see influences management practices very robustly.
All right, cool. 3 more questions. I think 1, 2, 3. Going that way.
Well, maybe everyone should all ask questions briefly, and then I can ask them.
Well, if you want to.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, very quickly. Could it also be that schools would adjust their curriculums or their courses that they offer after such a grant, because they can now have a lab, or that they will modernize what kind of courses they offer?
Yeah, it's possible that colleges do that. It's a big black box. We don't really know what the colleges are doing. Like if they're then able to offer, an engineering course they haven't been able to offer before, or something like that, that might explain some of the results that we're finding.
Curious about this last bullet point, this idea that the ROI would likely be greater for management training. Is it possible that you can get both with management training? Is it possible that better managers need to hire capital grants?
Yeah, there's probably an interaction between the two inputs. We have cross-sectional information we've cross-sectional information on management practices, not managers as such, management practices. And then we have, of course, better data on capital grants and that you have them over a period of time. So I'm sure that there'd be lots of interesting work one could do, in theory at least, on complementarities that would be very interesting to look at, that I don't think we're able to just now.
Yeah.
I can ask her later.
In that case,
Thank you very much, Sam. Sign up if you want to tomorrow night.
Colleges are,
Ok, possiamo chiudere. Grazie. Ci vediamo domani.